My name's Eric. I'm 27, and if you had told me a year ago that my family would almost rip itself apart over something as simple as a birthday gift, I probably would have laughed. But here I am, sitting down to write this out, because the story has been eating at me. It's one of those moments where you realize how twisted family dynamics can get, and how much a single act of pettiness can pull back the curtain on years of simmering resentment you didn't want to see. For context, my dad and I have always had a close relationship. He wasn't the perfect father, but he was the kind of guy who showed up. Soccer games, late-night study sessions, teaching me how to drive stick. Those memories still matter to me. My brother, on the other hand, has always had this competitive streak with me. He's older by 2 years, and growing up, everything felt like a race I didn't even want to run. If I got a B+, he had to wave around an A. If I saved up for a used car, he went and bragged about leasing something newer. And while I tried to just let it slide most of the time, it always stung because my parents, especially mom, had a way of brushing off his behavior like, oh, that's just how he is. So when Dad's birthday was coming up, I wanted to do something meaningful. The man isn't big on material things, but he has a soft spot for watches. He'd always pause at displays when we were out together, even if he didn't buy anything. I'd been working extra hours, cutting back on little luxuries, skipping nights out with friends just to save up for this custom piece I found from a local craftsman. The design was simple but elegant, with Dad's initials engraved on the back and the year he got married to Mom tucked into the dial. It wasn't flashy, but it was thoughtful, and I was proud. Like, for once, I could give something that wasn't just store-bought, but something that actually carried meaning. The night of Dad's party was supposed to be perfect. Mom planned a big dinner at our house, invited the extended family, and everyone was dressed up. I showed up early with the box in my jacket pocket, just waiting for the right moment. My plan was simple. After the cake, I'd give him the watch and say a few words about how much he meant to me. Nothing over the top, just something heartfelt. But here's where the first cracks showed. When I got there, my brother, let's call him Daniel, was already holding court in the living room, bragging about this expensive bottle of scotch he splurged on for Dad. He made sure everyone heard the price tag, loud and clear. I didn't think much of it, honestly. Let him have his moment. But then, while Mom was fussing in the kitchen, Daniel leaned over to me and asked, "So what did you get him? You always bring something cheap from the mall, right?" The smirk on his face made me want to snap back, but I just smiled and said, "You'll see." That seemed to set him off in a way I didn't fully understand at the time. The rest of the evening, he kept circling back, dropping little comments about how he was Dad's favorite son, how he always knew what Dad liked, and how it must be hard to keep up. I brushed it off with half smiles, but inside, I was irritated. It wasn't even about competing, it was about doing something personal for Dad, not winning some imaginary contest. And then the moment that changed everything happened. We were about 15 minutes away from Dad arriving. People were chatting, glasses clinking, the air buzzing with that pre-party energy. I had stepped into the hallway to check the box one last time, making sure the watch was secure in its velvet cushion. That's when Daniel appeared out of nowhere. His eyes flicked to the box, and before I could even react, he snatched it from my hands. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked, reaching for it. But he held it up like a trophy and said, "So this is your big surprise? Cute. But no way you're outshining me tonight." And before I could process what he meant, he dropped the box on the hardwood floor and stomped on it. The sound of glass shattering inside felt like something breaking in my chest. I froze. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. He just looked at me with this smug satisfaction, like he'd finally proven some unspoken point. I didn't yell. I didn't lunge at him. I just stood there, staring at the crushed box on the floor, my hands trembling. People in the next room didn't hear. It all happened so fast and quiet. He leaned closer and whispered, "You should thank me. Now Dad won't think you're trying too hard." Then he walked away like nothing had happened. I picked up the box with shaking hands, my throat tight. The watch was ruined. The dial cracked, the leather band bent. All those hours of work, the sacrifices, the thought I'd poured into it, it was gone in seconds. And for what? So my brother could feel like the bigger man at a family dinner. When Dad arrived, I couldn't bring myself to give him the broken gift. Daniel, of course, strutted forward with his scotch, making a big show of it. Everyone clapped, and Dad smiled, thanking him. I sat in silence, my appetite gone, replaying the moment in the hallway over and over. The worst part came the next morning. My phone rang, and it was Mom. Her voice was hushed, almost panicked. "Eric," she said, "I know what happened last night. Daniel told me. Please, don't tell your father. He'd be devastated. It'll only cause a fight. Just let it go, okay?" I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream. Why are you protecting him? Why does he get away with everything? But instead, I just sat there in stunned silence as she pleaded. "It's just a gift, sweetheart. Don't ruin your father's birthday over this. Promise me you won't say anything." That was the moment something inside me shifted. It wasn't just about the watch anymore. It was about years of excuses, years of favoritism, years of me being told to be the bigger person, while Daniel bulldozed through everyone else's feelings. And now, Mom was asking me to cover for him again, at my expense. I hung up the phone without promising anything. And that's when the idea started to form. Not just to stand up for myself, but to make sure the truth came out in a way nobody could ignore. The morning after Dad's birthday was one of those moments where you expect to wake up and feel lighter, like maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed the night before. But the first thing I saw when I rolled over and checked my phone was a string of text messages from Mom. All of them variations of the same theme. "Please don't say anything. Don't ruin this. Let it go. It'll only make things worse." I stared at the screen for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to reply with every ounce of anger I felt, to unload years of bottled-up frustration, but I couldn't. Instead, I just set the phone down and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, replaying the sound of that watch cracking in its box. I didn't hear from Dad that morning. He was probably still basking in the glow of his party, showing off Daniel's expensive scotch to his friends, completely oblivious to the way his other son had gutted me the night before. And that silence burned. Because here I was, holding onto the wreckage of something I had worked so hard for, and Dad didn't even know it existed. Later that day, Mom called again. This time, her tone was softer, almost sweet, like she thought she could smooth things over with the right words. "Eric, honey, I know you're upset, but you've always been the responsible one. You don't hold grudges. That's why I need you to just let this slide. Daniel, he didn't mean it." "Didn't mean it?" He stomped on the gift. He looked me in the eye while he did it. He whispered like it was some victory. But Mom's words hung in the air, that phrase I'd heard my whole life. He didn't mean it. It was the same excuse she used when Daniel borrowed my things without asking, when he humiliated me in front of my friends as a teenager, when he got into trouble, and somehow I was the one who had to set a good example. I bit back my frustration and just said, "I'm fine." She seemed relieved, like that was all she needed to hear, and quickly moved on to asking if I could come by the house the next weekend to help clean up after the party. "Your brother is busy with work," she added. Of course, Daniel could smash my gift and still get out of cleaning up his own mess. By the time Saturday rolled around, I found myself standing in my parents' kitchen, scrubbing dishes while Daniel lounged on the couch in the living room, flipping channels. He glanced over at me once and smirked, the same smug expression he wore when he destroyed the watch. Mom, bustling around with a dish towel in hand, didn't say a word about it. She just kept praising Daniel for how generous his gift had been. "That scotch was such a thoughtful touch," she said at least 3 times, loud enough for me to hear. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt, but I stayed silent. That had become my role. Be quiet. Be the bigger person. Keep the peace. But inside, a storm was brewing. The favoritism became even clearer when Dad walked into the room. He clapped Daniel on the back and said, "That was some gift, son. You really know how to make an impression." Then, almost as an afterthought, he glanced at me and asked, "Eric, did you bring something last night?" "I can't remember." Before I could answer, Mom swooped in. "Oh, Eric was busy, weren't you, honey? He's been saving up for his own things. You know how careful he is with money." Her smile was too polished, too quick, like she'd rehearsed the line. I just stood there, dish towel in hand, and swallowed down the lump in my throat. Dad didn't push further, but I caught the faint disappointment in his eyes, the kind of look that said, "I wish you'd done more." And it killed me. Not because I wanted the praise, but because I had done more. I had done everything. And thanks to Daniel, Dad would never know. The following weeks only made things worse. Every time I visited my parents' house, Daniel was there, holding court like he owned the place. Mom would gush about his latest purchases, new shoes, a new phone, A weekend getaway he treated himself to. Dad would laugh along, glass of scotch in hand, oblivious to the way I sat in silence at the edge of the room. At one point, Dad even joked, "You need to take a page from your brother's book, Eric. Live a little." I forced a smile, but inside, I was boiling. How could I explain that the reason I didn't live a little was because I'd been saving for months to buy a gift that Daniel had stomped into oblivion? How could I tell him that his golden child wasn't generous, but cruel? And the manipulation didn't stop at silence. It grew. Mom started calling me more often, always with the same tone, sweet, coaxing, but firm underneath. "Eric, don't bring it up. Your father doesn't need the stress." Or, "Daniel's under a lot of pressure right now. Don't make things harder for him." It was like she had decided my only role in the family was to absorb the blows and never strike back. The final straw in this stage came a few weeks later during a family dinner. We were all seated around the table, passing plates of food, when Dad raised his glass and said, "Let's toast to Daniel. He's been so thoughtful lately, always looking out for me." The room erupted in cheers, even Mom wiping away a tear. I sat there with my fork poised above my plate, my stomach turning. Daniel looked at me across the table, his smile wide and triumphant, as if daring me to say something. And for a split second, I almost did. I almost blurted out the truth in front of everyone, shattered the illusion, ripped the mask off. But then I caught Mom's eyes, that pleading look she'd perfected, silently begging me to stay quiet. So I lowered my fork, forced a smile, and raised my glass. But inside, something snapped. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep playing this role forever. I couldn't keep letting them paint Daniel as the hero while I stood in the shadows, silently swallowing the truth. And here's the thing. Once that realization took root, I started noticing more. Little cracks in the way Daniel spoke, the way Mom rushed to cover for him, the way Dad seemed blind to the patterns right in front of him. And I began to wonder, what would happen if I stopped being silent? If I stopped letting them manipulate me into compliance? That thought scared me, but it also lit something in me. Because for the first time, I realized silence was exactly what they were counting on. And maybe, just maybe, breaking it was the only way to finally shift the balance. I thought things had already hit their low point after the watch incident. I figured nothing Daniel could do would shock me anymore, not after he'd stomped on months of my effort just to feed his ego. But I was wrong. Because the worst part about betrayal isn't always the first strike. It's the follow-up, the moment you realize it wasn't a one-off. It's a pattern. It's who they are. And when it came to my brother, I was about to find out just how far he was willing to go. It started with whispers. That's how most betrayals do, isn't it? At first, they're small enough to ignore, easy to brush aside as paranoia. One night after work, I met up with an old family friend for coffee, someone I hadn't seen in years. We got to catching up, and out of nowhere she said, "I heard about your dad's birthday. That was sweet of you to get him that bottle." I froze, my spoon halfway to stirring sugar into my cup. "What bottle?" "You know, the scotch. Daniel said you went halves on it with him. That was so nice of you. He said you couldn't afford something like that on your own, but you wanted to contribute." I felt my stomach drop. Heat crept up my neck, and I laughed, though it wasn't because anything was funny. "Yeah, something like that," I muttered, and quickly changed the subject. But inside, I was reeling. Not only had Daniel destroyed my actual gift, but he had rewritten the story so that the one thing Dad praised him for wasn't even his alone, it was ours. Except in his version, he was the generous one, and I was the broke little brother just tagging along. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation, imagining how many people Daniel had spun that story to. I pictured relatives at Sunday brunch nodding sympathetically, saying, "Poor Eric, he means well," while clinking glasses to Daniel's supposed generosity. It wasn't just theft of a gift anymore. It was theft of my reputation. A week later, the betrayal deepened. Dad had invited a few colleagues and old friends over for drinks, and of course I was expected to be there. When I arrived, the house was buzzing with laughter. I walked in just in time to hear Dad bragging about his boys. My heart warmed for a second. Maybe this was a chance. Maybe he would say something kind about me. But then I heard it. "Eric's careful with money, always saving. He's practical, you know. But Daniel, he's got that generous spirit. He makes sure nobody's left out. That's what I admire about him." The men around him chuckled and nodded, raising their glasses. My brother, sitting with one arm slung lazily over the back of the chair, met my eyes across the room with that same smug smile, the kind that said, "You can't touch this." I own the narrative. I wanted to scream, to grab Dad by the shoulders and tell him the truth, that his golden boy had destroyed the one gift that actually had meaning, then turned around and smeared me as the brother who couldn't pull his own weight. But Mom's voice echoed in my head, that pleading whisper from the morning after, "Don't say anything. Don't ruin this." So I bit my tongue. I smiled when people looked my way, and I excused myself early that night, lying about an early shift. But in reality, I drove around aimlessly for hours, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached, trying to swallow the bitterness that felt like it was rotting me from the inside. The real breaking point came 2 weeks later, when Dad called me out of the blue. His tone was serious, almost disappointed. "Eric," he said, "I need to ask, are you struggling financially?" I blinked at the phone in disbelief. "No, why?" "Your brother mentioned you've been tight on money, that you've been cutting corners. He said you could barely chip in for his gift at my party. You know you can always come to me if you're having trouble, right?" I sat there in silence, my chest tight, my throat dry. He thought I was struggling. He thought I hadn't been able to stand on my own 2 feet. And the worst part? It wasn't just pity in his voice. It was disappointment, like I'd let him down. In that moment, something inside me cracked. I felt years of swallowed frustration surge to the surface. I wanted to shout the truth, to tell him everything. But when I opened my mouth, the words stuck. Because I realized even if I told him, would he believe me? Or would he think I was just jealous of Daniel, lashing out because I couldn't handle my brother's success? I managed to choke out, "I'm fine, Dad. Really, don't worry about me." He sighed, and the conversation ended with a hollow, "All right, son. Just know I'm here." But the damage was done. My brother hadn't just stolen credit. He'd stolen my father's perception of me. He'd painted me as weak, dependent, barely holding on. And Dad believed it. The betrayal didn't stop there. A few days later, Mom called again, her voice sharper this time. "Eric, I need you to do something for me. Daniel's planning a big dinner for your father, and I want you to help cover some of the costs." I almost dropped the phone. "Cover the costs? Why would I?" "Because you're the responsible one," she interrupted. "You've always been better with money. Daniel's just not as disciplined. He needs your help, and it'll mean a lot to your father if you both contribute." I was speechless. Daniel, who had already stolen my gift and smeared my name, was now using me as his personal bank. And Mom was asking me to go along with it, like it was my duty, like I existed solely to make up for his recklessness. I told her I'd think about it, then hung up, my blood boiling. For hours I paced my apartment, replaying the conversation. The audacity of it all. The way they twisted every situation to make me the safety net while Daniel basked in the glory. And the sickest part? They didn't even see it as unfair. To them, it was natural. Expected. The final twist of the knife came that weekend. I showed up at my parents' house for Sunday dinner, already on edge. Halfway through the meal, Dad raised his glass and said, "I just want to thank both my boys, Daniel for planning this beautiful dinner, and Eric for pitching in to make it happen." I froze, my fork clattering against my plate. Everyone turned to me with smiles, nodding approvingly. Daniel smirked, lifting his glass in my direction like he was toasting me. And in that moment, I realized he had done it again. He had turned me into the silent supporting character in his story, the background player whose only role was to prop him up. The room spun around me as laughter and chatter filled the air. I felt trapped, suffocated, humiliated. And yet, I raised my glass, because what else could I do? That night, lying awake in my apartment, I stared at the ceiling and finally admitted it to myself. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was betrayal. My brother hadn't just stepped on my gift, he had stepped on me. He had stolen my effort, my reputation, my standing in the family. And my parents had let him. Something hardened in me that night. Because if this was the role they expected me to play, then they had no idea what I was capable of when I finally stopped playing it. I didn't think it was possible to feel smaller than I did at that dinner table. Listening to my father praise Daniel for the dinner I had essentially been forced to bankroll. But in the weeks that followed, I learned that humiliation has layers, and once you've been pushed down one, there's always another waiting underneath. After that night, things began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. My parents started treating me differently, not maliciously, at least not openly, but with a subtle, suffocating pity. Every comment, every look seemed laced with unspoken judgment. Dad would ask about work with this faintly disappointed tone, like he was waiting for me to admit I was struggling. Mom would drop hints about how practical I needed to be with my finances, as if I hadn't been the one holding things together while Daniel spun his stories. And Daniel, he leaned into it. Hard. He started making little digs in front of the family, things he'd never dared to say outright before because they would have sounded ridiculous. But now, with the false reputation he'd painted of me as the struggling brother, people just accepted them. At Sunday lunch, when Dad asked how my job was going, Daniel chimed in with, "Probably tough to save much on that salary, huh?" Everyone chuckled lightly, like it was harmless teasing, but my stomach churned. At first, I tried to laugh it off, force the smile, play the game. But every time I did, I could feel something inside me withering. Because I knew the truth, that I was being turned into the family's punchline, their cautionary tale, their example of what not to be. And it didn't stop with words. One night, I came by the house to drop off some tools Dad had asked to borrow, and when I walked into the living room, I found Daniel showing off his new watch. Not the exact one I had bought for Dad, but close, same brand, same style, just flashier. He caught my eye and smiled, tapping the dial like it was some private joke between us. Nice, right? Real craftsmanship. Cost me a fortune, but worth every penny. I felt my chest tighten, the memory of my shattered gift rushing back like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just rubbing it in anymore. He was taunting me, twisting the knife deeper every chance he got. It was around then that I started withdrawing. I stopped volunteering to come over for dinners. I cut conversations with my parents shorter, making excuses about being busy with work. When Daniel called me, usually with some smug story or backhanded comment, I let it go to voicemail. At first, it felt like a relief, like I was reclaiming some control by stepping back. But soon, the isolation set in. Because the thing about walking away from family is that it leaves a hole. As toxic as those gatherings had become, they were still a part of my routine, still tied to the idea of belonging. And when I pulled back, the silence of my apartment grew louder. Meals eaten alone felt heavier. Nights stretched longer. And slowly, that sense of bitterness curdled into something darker, doubt. What if they were right? What if I was the weaker one, the one who couldn't measure up? What if Dad really was disappointed in me, not because of Daniel's lies, but because of who I actually was? That doubt festered. At work, I found myself distracted, second-guessing every decision. I stopped joining friends for drinks, stopped answering their texts. Even small things, like buying groceries or paying bills, started to feel like proof of my so-called struggle. I'd stand in the checkout line, staring at the receipt, and hear Daniel's voice in my head. Probably tough to save much on that salary, huh? The lowest point came one night in late spring. I had stayed late at the office, half working, half trying to avoid going home to the empty apartment. When I finally left, the streets were quiet, and I found myself wandering aimlessly. I ended up at a park bench, sitting under a streetlight, staring at the cracked pavement. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't check it. I just sat there, hollow, asking myself the same question over and over. How did it come to this? I had always believed that if I just worked hard, stayed honest, and kept my head down, things would balance out eventually. That Dad would see me for who I really was. That Mom would stop making excuses for Daniel. That my brother would grow up and stop treating life like a competition he had to win at any cost. But sitting there in the cold night air, I realized that none of that was happening. Not on its own. Not if I stayed silent. That thought scared me, because it meant the only way out of this hole was to climb, and climbing meant fighting back. Something I'd avoided my whole life. But before I could act, life had one more way of grinding me down. A few days later, Dad called again. His tone was clipped, serious. "Eric, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come by the house tonight?" My heart sank. I drove over with a pit in my stomach, rehearsing all the possibilities. Had Daniel told another lie? Was this about money again? When I walked in, Dad was sitting at the dining room table, papers spread out in front of him. Mom stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Sit down," Dad said. I did. He pushed a paper toward me. It was a printout of an email. "Your brother says you asked him for a loan last month," Dad said, his eyes searching mine. "He said you were too embarrassed to tell me directly." "Eric, is that true?" I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Alone? I had never asked Daniel for a cent. The audacity of it left me stunned. I shook my head slowly. No, that's not true. Mom shifted, her voice low but insistent. Eric, just be honest. If you're struggling, we need to know. You can't keep hiding it. My hands shook as I pushed the paper back. I never asked him for a loan. He's lying. But the way they looked at me, it wasn't belief. It was doubt. My own parents, the people who were supposed to know me better than anyone, sat there questioning my honesty while swallowing Daniel's lies whole. That was the breaking point. Not the shattered watch, not the stolen credit, not even the pitying looks. It was sitting there, staring into my father's eyes and realizing he didn't trust me. That my word, my truth, weighed less than Daniel's manipulation. I left that night without saying goodbye. I got into my car, slammed the door, and sat in the dark driveway for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel and shaking. My heart pounded, my chest ached, my throat burned from holding back the words I wanted to scream. But no matter how loud I wanted to shout the truth, I knew it wouldn't matter. Not to them. Not right now. And that's when the shift happened. Sitting in that car, I realized I had two choices. Keep playing the victim or quietly start rewriting the story. Because if Daniel could spin lies so easily, maybe it was time I learned how to control the narrative myself. The thought scared me, but it also lit something deep inside me, a spark I hadn't felt in years. Because maybe the way out of rock bottom wasn't to climb back to where I had been, but to dig deeper, find a way under, and come up stronger on the other side. So I drove home that night, still raw, still aching, but with a seed of something new taking root. Not a plan yet, just the beginning of one. A quiet determination that for once in my life, I wouldn't stay silent. When you hit rock bottom, there's this strange silence that follows. It's not peace, not yet, but more like a numb clarity. That's where I found myself after the night Dad slid that fake loan email across the table and looked at me like I was lying. For days, I moved through life like a ghost. Work, sleep, meals, all of it blurred together. But under that fog, something had shifted. I realized that waiting for validation from my family was never going to work. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I sacrificed, Mom would always cover for Daniel, and Dad would always take Daniel's word over mine. I couldn't change that. But what I could change was where I placed my energy. For once, I stopped living as if I was in Daniel's shadow. The first change was at work. I had been coasting, if I'm honest. Showing up, getting things done, but never pushing myself. My confidence had been eaten away by years of being compared to Daniel, so I never dared to step forward. But after that night, something in me hardened. I started volunteering for projects that scared me. I stayed late, not to avoid going home this time, but because I wanted to sharpen my skills. I forced myself into conversations I'd normally shy away from. Slowly, my manager began noticing. It wasn't overnight. There were still moments of doubt, moments I'd hear Daniel's voice in my head mocking me. But I pushed through, and after a few months, I got offered a small leadership role on a new project. Nothing major, but it was the first time in years I felt like someone believed in me professionally. I remember walking out of that meeting with a strange feeling, like a door had finally cracked open. Around the same time, I began reconnecting with old friends. For months, I had pulled away from them, ashamed of how things at home made me feel small. But one friend in particular, Matt, kept reaching out. Finally, I gave in and met him for dinner. We talked for hours, and I admitted some of what I'd been going through, not all the details, but enough for him to understand. He didn't pity me. He didn't tell me to get over it. He just listened. And when he said, "Eric, you're tougher than you think," something in me loosened. From then on, I made a point of saying yes to invitations I would have turned down before. Drinks after work, weekend hikes, even just casual lunches. And slowly, I realized how much I had missed out on by shrinking myself down for so long. Being around people who saw me as capable, who laughed at my jokes, who valued my presence. It was like a reminder of who I really was, underneath all the family baggage. Financially, too, things started looking up. With the new project at work came a small raise, and instead of letting it vanish into rent and groceries, I made a plan. I set up a separate savings account and started funneling money into it. At first it was small, just enough to feel like I was doing something for myself. But with each paycheck, watching the numbers grow gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. And here's the interesting thing. As my life outside the family improved, the contrast became sharper. Every time I went back to my parents' house for a meal, I could see the dysfunction more clearly. Daniel would brag about his latest splurge, a new gadget, a weekend trip, a flashy dinner out, while Mom fawned over him and Dad nodded along. They'd still throw in little jabs about me, still treat me like the practical one who needed to be careful. But instead of sinking under the weight of it, I started feeling detached, almost amused, because while they were locked in their old patterns, I was changing. The real turning point came when I landed a promotion. It wasn't expected, not by me, not by anyone. But the project I had led ended up being a success, and my boss pulled me into his office one morning with a smile. "You've got a knack for leadership, Eric. We want to give you a bigger role." I walked out of that office with my heart pounding. A bigger role meant more responsibility, sure, but it also meant more visibility, more opportunities, more money, more growth. For the first time, I wasn't just keeping up. I was pulling ahead, at least in my own lane. And here's the part that stung in the best way. I didn't tell my family right away. For years, every accomplishment I had was either overshadowed by Daniel or dismissed as not as big a deal. So this time, I kept it close. I let myself savor it privately, building on it quietly, brick by brick. Of course, Daniel eventually found out. He always did. And when he did, he tried to downplay it. Middle management? Congrats, I guess. Guess someone's got to do the boring work. But this time it rolled off me. Because I knew the truth. I knew what it meant. And no amount of his mockery could take that from me. As months passed, my world kept expanding. I traveled for work once, something Daniel had never done. I started investing small amounts into things I cared about, building not just a savings account, but actual assets. I upgraded my apartment, not flashy, but comfortable mine. Every step I took away from their control made me feel stronger. But the real power came not just from success, but from clarity. I began seeing my family dynamics with fresh eyes. Mom wasn't just protecting Daniel. She was enabling him, keeping him dependent by covering for him. Dad wasn't just blind. He was choosing the easier narrative, the one where Daniel was the generous son and I was the cautious one. And Daniel? He wasn't strong. He was fragile. Every boast, every lie, every act of sabotage was rooted in fear. Fear that if I ever stepped fully into myself, he'd lose his crown. And that realization planted a seed. If his power came from controlling the story, from manipulating how others saw me, then maybe my path forward was simple: rewrite the story. Not with lies, not with petty fights, but with undeniable truth. With success so visible it couldn't be ignored, with strength so steady it couldn't be denied. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about building a foundation so solid that when the moment came, I'd be ready. So I kept working, kept saving, kept growing. On the surface, I played the same quiet role around my family, nodding along, smiling politely, letting them underestimate me. But inside, I was sharpening myself, preparing, because deep down, I knew this story wasn't finished. Daniel hadn't had his last laugh, and neither had I. The rise felt good, better than I'd expected, honestly. For the first time in years, I was standing on ground that felt solid beneath my feet. My job was no longer just a paycheck, it was a platform. My friendships weren't just distractions, they were lifelines. And my savings weren't just numbers, they were options. But with that stability came something else: perspective. I started noticing patterns I'd missed before. How Daniel's big purchases weren't signs of wealth, but of desperation. How Mom's constant defense of him sounded less like pride and more like panic. And how Dad, despite his stern exterior, was beginning to show cracks of doubt when Daniel talked too big. It all clicked one evening when I came over for dinner. Daniel was holding court at the table, bragging about some business opportunity he was getting into. According to him, he'd found a group of investors willing to back his new idea, something vague about a bar and restaurant with a modern twist. He was spinning his story with so much confidence that everyone leaned in, nodding along. But then Dad asked a simple question: "How much are you putting in yourself?" Daniel faltered, just for a second, but I caught it. He quickly recovered with, "Oh, you know, I'll contribute what I can, but they're mostly interested in my vision." That's when I knew. My brother wasn't successful. He was drowning. All the flash, all the bragging, all the expensive gifts and trips, they weren't signs of prosperity. They were signs of a man living beyond his means, papering over cracks with stories. And that realization planted a dangerous, thrilling thought. What if I could use that? For weeks afterward, I paid attention. I stopped letting his noise wash over me and started listening closely. He was careless when he bragged, and buried in his arrogance were details, late credit card payments, an argument with a landlord, a car lease he was working on refinancing. One night, I overheard him on the phone, pacing Mom and Dad's kitchen, saying something about buying more time. He didn't see me in the hallway, listening as he promised whoever was on the other end that money was coming soon. I didn't need to dig further to know the truth. Daniel wasn't just living paycheck to paycheck. He was in debt, real debt. Meanwhile, my own life was quietly strengthening. The promotion at work turned into something more permanent, and my role expanded further. I found myself sitting in meetings I never would have been invited to a year ago, learning things about budgeting, finance, and negotiation. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me tools. Tools Daniel didn't have. One of the most valuable lessons came from a mentor at work, a senior manager named Laura. She wasn't flashy, but she was sharp, the kind of person who could spot weakness in a contract from a mile away. Over lunch one day, she told me, "Control isn't always about money. It's about information. Whoever controls the story controls the outcome." Those words hit me like a lightning bolt. Because wasn't that exactly what Daniel had been doing all along? Twisting narratives, controlling perceptions, making me the struggling brother while he played the generous son? But now I saw it differently. If I could gather the right information, if I could quietly build the truth, maybe I could flip the entire story on its head. So I started paying attention in new ways. I noticed when Mom let slip that Daniel had borrowed money from her again. I listened when Dad sighed about how Daniel had missed another deadline to help him with yard work. I asked subtle questions when Daniel bragged about new purchases, watching his eyes flicker just slightly when I pressed for details. And while I gathered information, I kept building myself up. My savings account turned into a sizable safety net. My investments began to grow. I took on side projects at work that gave me even more credibility. To my family, I was still practical Eric, the careful one. They had no idea that behind the scenes, I was becoming someone they wouldn't recognize. The moment that confirmed I was on the right path came during another family dinner. Dad had been unusually quiet while Daniel rambled on about his business plans. Finally, Dad turned to me and asked, "So, Eric, what about you? What have you been up to?" I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. "Just work. A few new projects, nothing major." But I saw the look in Dad's eyes, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even pride. He didn't say much, but it was enough. For once, Daniel wasn't the only son being noticed. And that tiny shift in attention made my brother bristle. He covered it with a laugh and a clap on my back, but I saw it. The flash of irritation in his eyes. That's when I realized something important. Daniel needed to be the center of attention. He fed on it. Without it, he grew restless, defensive, even desperate. And desperation, I knew, could make people sloppy. So I let him keep talking. I let him brag louder, promise bigger, spend more recklessly. Because every word he spoke, every promise he made, was another thread in the rope he was tying around his own neck. And here's the best part. While he thought I was still the quiet, practical brother in his shadow, I was becoming something else entirely. I was learning, preparing, waiting for the right moment. The setup wasn't complete yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time, I could see the path ahead. And I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd turn the entire story upside down. I'd been patient. Months of biting my tongue, months of playing along, months of listening while Daniel bragged and bluffed and borrowed his way through life. On the surface, nothing had changed. Mom still coddled him. Dad still praised his generosity. And I was still cast as the careful, practical one. But behind the scenes, I was building a web of truths, waiting for the right moment. That moment came sooner than I expected. It started with a phone call late on a Tuesday evening. I had just gotten home from work when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. When I answered, a man's voice introduced himself as Mark, representing a local supplier. "I was given your number by your brother Daniel. He said you'd be a guarantor for his restaurant project." I nearly dropped the phone. "Excuse me." "He said you'd co-sign some of the orders. We just need confirmation before moving forward." My pulse quickened, but I kept my tone calm. I never agreed to that. There was a pause on the other end. "So you're not backing him?" "No, I said firmly. And if he uses my name again, call me directly before anything is signed. We hung up, but my hands were shaking. It wasn't just that Daniel was lying again. He was trying to drag me into his sinking ship, tie my name to his debts so that if he went down, I'd go with him. That wasn't just arrogance anymore. That was desperation. And desperation, I knew, was my opening. The next time I saw him was at Sunday dinner. He was in rare form, pacing the living room, talking about how his restaurant was just weeks away from opening, how investors were lining up, how suppliers were bending over backward to work with him. I watched him spin his story, watched Mom beam with pride, watched Dad nod along. And for the first time, I felt no anger, just clarity, because I knew the truth now. I knew his project was a lie, his debts were mounting, and his empire was built on nothing but hot air. And I realized something else. If Daniel's power came from controlling the narrative, then the surest revenge was to let the truth speak louder than his lies. So I set my plan into motion. Step 1 was gathering proof. Over the next few weeks, I quietly reached out to the contacts Daniel had dragged me into, the supplier, the so-called investors, even his landlord. I didn't make accusations. I just asked questions. And the answers painted a clear picture. Daniel was behind on payments, stringing people along with empty promises, and more than one person was ready to cut ties if he didn't deliver soon. Step 2 was timing. I didn't want to confront him in private, where he could spin it or deny it. I wanted the truth to land where it mattered most, in front of the very people he'd been fooling. So I waited for the next big family gathering. It didn't take long. Mom announced she was planning a celebratory dinner to toast Daniel's new venture. Perfect. The night of the dinner, I showed up calm, collected, almost cheerful. Daniel was already there, dressed sharper than usual, grinning ear to ear. As relatives filtered in, he bragged about menus, seating charts, partnerships, painting a picture so vivid you'd think the restaurant was already thriving. Mom hovered proudly at his side. Dad poured drinks, and everyone laughed along. I waited, patient, silent. Finally, when dinner was served and glasses were raised, Mom cleared her throat. I just want to say how proud I am of my boys. Daniel, for his incredible ambition and generosity, and Eric, for always being so dependable. She smiled warmly at me, but I could hear the undertone. Dependable, cautious, careful. The same label I'd carried my whole life. And that's when I struck. I stood up, raising my glass. Actually, Mom, I'd like to make a toast too. To Daniel, for teaching me something valuable. The room quieted. Daniel smirked, nodding like he expected praise. I continued, my voice steady. He's taught me how important it is to tell the truth. Because the truth, unlike stories, doesn't crack under pressure. Daniel's smile faltered. A flicker of unease crossed his face. I set my glass down and pulled a small folder from my jacket. I had debated bringing it, debated how far to go, but in the end, I knew it was necessary. I opened it slowly, letting the papers fan out. See, while Daniel's been telling everyone about his big restaurant venture, I've been doing some homework, talking to suppliers, investors, even his landlord. The room shifted. Chairs creaked, forks clinked. Dad's brow furrowed. Mom stiffened. I held up one page. This supplier says Daniel hasn't paid him in months. This investor says Daniel promised him returns that don't exist. And this, I tapped another paper, is a notice from his landlord about overdue rent. Gasps rippled through the table. Daniel stood abruptly, face red. This is garbage. Lies. You don't know what you're talking about. But I just looked at him calm. Funny. That's exactly what you said when you smashed the gift I bought for Dad. The difference is, this time, I've got proof. The silence was deafening. Dad looked from me to Daniel, his face a storm of confusion and anger. Mom opened her mouth, but no words came. And Daniel, for once, had nothing. No smug smile, no clever spin. Just a mask cracking under the weight of truth. I didn't push further. I didn't need to. I closed the folder, slid it back into my jacket, and sat down. So yes, Mom, I am dependable. Because when I speak, it's the truth. And maybe that's worth more than any story. The rest of the dinner was a blur of tension. Nobody knew what to say. Daniel tried to recover, muttering about misunderstandings, but the damage was done. The room had seen the cracks. The illusion was broken. And as I watched him squirm, I realized something important. Revenge didn't have to be loud. It didn't have to be cruel. Sometimes, The most satisfying revenge was simply letting the truth echo louder than the lies. But this wasn't the end, not yet. The fallout was still to come, and I knew when it hit, it would be seismic. The silence after my toast felt like it stretched forever. Plates of food sat untouched, the clink of silverware replaced by an uncomfortable hum in the air. Daniel stood stiff, his fists balled at his sides, his face crimson. He looked like a man about to explode, but the weight of the evidence I'd laid out pinned him in place. Finally, Dad broke the silence. His voice was low, rough. "Daniel, is this true?" Daniel sputtered, waving a hand toward me. "He's twisting things. He's jealous. He's always been jealous." But Dad didn't look at me. His eyes were locked on my brother, sharp and unrelenting. "Answer me." For the first time in my life, I saw Daniel falter. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His usual smirk, the one that had carried him through every bluff and every lie, was gone. He looked small. Mom rushed in like she always did, her voice desperate. "Oh, he's just under stress. Everyone makes mistakes. Eric, you didn't need to." "No, Margaret." Dad's voice cut through hers like a blade. He leaned back in his chair, his face set. "I want to hear it from him." Daniel's jaw tightened. He muttered something I couldn't make out, then finally said louder, "Fine. I've had some issues, but I'm handling it." Dad's eyes narrowed. "Handling it? By dragging your brother's name into it? By lying to us?" The air grew heavy. Relatives who had been quiet until now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One of my uncles, never known for subtlety, muttered, "Always knew he was full of hot air." Another cousin whispered something that made her husband shake his head. The tide in the room had shifted, and Daniel felt it. His confidence drained with every second of silence. He turned to me, his face twisted with rage. "You think you're clever, don't you? You've been waiting to humiliate me. That's what this was about. You couldn't stand that I cut him off, calm and steady. "This wasn't about humiliating you, Daniel. This was about truth. You've been lying to everyone for years, and you tried to drag me down with you. That ends tonight." The words hung in the air, and I meant everyone. Dad stood slowly, his hands braced against the table. He looked at me first, then back at Daniel. "I've given you the benefit of the doubt for too long. I believed you when I shouldn't have, and I doubted the son who has never lied to me once." His voice cracked, just slightly, but his eyes burned. "That changes now." Daniel's face paled. He looked around the room for support, for Mom's rescuing words, for the nods and approval that had always been his armor. But they weren't there. Mom opened her mouth, then closed it, tears in her eyes. She looked torn, but even she couldn't bridge the gap this time. For once, everyone saw him clearly. Not as the golden child, not as the generous brother, but as the liar, the manipulator, the man who had built his image on nothing but smoke. The rest of the night unraveled quickly. Dad demanded to see documents. Relatives whispered about debts and lies. Mom tried to smooth things over, but her words fell flat, empty. Daniel stormed out halfway through dinner, slamming the door behind him, his bravado finally crumbling. The fallout stretched into the weeks that followed. I didn't need to twist the knife. The truth had done that for me. Calls came in from relatives who wanted to check in, some apologizing for believing Daniel's stories, others simply curious to know what would happen next. At work, I stayed focused, knowing that my foundation was solid. At home, I slept easier, lighter, no longer carrying the weight of silence. Dad called me one evening not long after. His voice was quieter than usual, almost humble. "Eric," he said, "I owe you an apology. For not listening. For doubting you. For all of it." There was a pause, and then, "I'm proud of you. More than I've ever said." I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, my throat tight. For years, I had waited to hear those words. And while part of me wished they had come sooner, I realized that hearing them now, after everything, made them mean even more. As for Daniel, his restaurant venture collapsed within months. The debts caught up with him, the investors pulled out, and his reputation crumbled. Mom still tried to defend him now and then, but even she couldn't deny the truth. Dad grew distant from him, unwilling to tolerate more lies. And the family, once enthralled by his stories, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. The crown he had clung to for so long was gone. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I kept living my life, growing, building, surrounding myself with people who saw me for who I truly was. But every now and then, When I thought back to that night at the dinner table, the folder in my hands, the silence in the room, the look on Daniel's face as his world collapsed, I couldn't help but smile. Because for once, the truth had been louder than the lies. And that was enough.